Before New York had yellow cabs, tabloids, Twitter fights, or people yelling at each other over parking spaces, it had Anthony Jansen van Salee and Grietje Reyniers. And if the surviving court records are any indication, these two may have had a strong case for being among the original documented shit-talkers of New York. This is a story about a pirate's son, a woman forced into public shame, a minister who married them and later became their enemy, a payroll dispute involving a goat, a banishment from Manhattan, and a family fight that somehow ends with Anthony in shackles. Because sometimes genealogy does not hand you kings and castles. Sometimes it hands you court fines, livestock, and one very tired colonial government. This is case number 2 from the Ancestorer Detective Agency, Public Disturbers. In case number 1, we followed Jansen, the Dutch privateer who became Reyniers, one of the most famous corsairs of Salee. But Jan's story did not end in North Africa. It crossed the Atlantic with his son, Anthony Jansen van Salee. Anthony's origins are messy, and we are going to come back to that in the next case because the mystery of his mother, Margarita, deserves its own file. For now, here's what matters. By the time Anthony appears in New Amsterdam, he is known in the records as Anthony Jansen from Salee, and later remembered by a sharper label, Anthony the Turk. That does not necessarily mean he was Turkish. In that world, Turk was often used broadly for Muslims, North Africans, or people Europeans shoved into the not like us drawer. So was Anthony Muslim? Accounts suggest that he was not a religious man. Was he from a Muslim background family? Very likely. Was New Amsterdam ready for him? Absolutely not. Anthony arrived with his wife, Grietje Reyniers. And Grietje was not a background character. She was from Wessel, in what is now Germany. She had already been married once before. By December 1629, she was a widow, and she and Anthony received permission to marry aboard the ship carrying them towards New Netherland. Their marriage record describes Anthony as a 22-year-old seaman from Cartagena and Grietje as a widow from Wessel. And here's where the story starts acting like it knows how to write television. The minister connected to their shipboard marriage was Reverend Everdus Bogardus, the same Reverend Bogardus who, less than a decade later, would become one of their courtroom enemies. This is not foreshadowing. This is history standing in the corner, grinning like a lunatic. By 1638, Anthony and Grietje were living in New Amsterdam, and Anthony was already entering the court records with some style. In April and May of that year, Anthony Jansen from Salee appears in a slander case against Hendrik Jansen. The court recommended that the two men live peacefully as neighbors, with a 25 guilder penalty for whoever kept the fight going. So Anthony does not enter the paper trail gently. He enters it like a man who heard the word lawsuit and said, "Finally, a hobby." Then came the fight with Reverend Bogardus. In September 1638, Anthony sued Bogardus for 74 guilders. Bogardus swore he only owed 7, and a judgment was entered for that smaller amount. A week later, Bogardus was suing Anthony for slander. Then Grietje entered the chat. She accused Reverend Bogardus of being a perjurer, basically calling the minister a liar under oath. In a tiny Dutch colony where the church, the court, and everyone's personal business were stacked on top of each other like badly packed luggage, this was not a small thing. The court ordered Grietje to stand publicly at Fort Amsterdam at the ringing of the bell and declare that Reverend Bogardus was an honest and honorable man. She had to admit she had lied. She had to pay court costs, and she had to give 3 guilders to the poor. Anthony was ordered to keep the peace and pay a 12 guilder fine. Let me repeat that. They rang the bell, they made her stand there in public and take it back. New Amsterdam had a public shame bell, and Grietje got herself scheduled under it.
Ik beke dat ik geloot heb nou ik door meer Bogaarders en meijenelige maan noem het. Ik smiek God, de rechtaard en Bogaarders om vergeving.
But even that did not end the Bogardus feud. In the same run of records, Anthony also had to declare that he had nothing to say against Bogardus' wife, Annette Jans, and acknowledge her as an honest and virtuous woman. So this was not a single argument. This was a full household-to-household colonial grudge match, and the court's minutes do not stop there. Anthony shows up again for allegedly carrying off timber someone else had cut. And there is a case involving the loss of a hog. Then, in 1639, several people bring slander cases against him at once. And then comes my favorite piece of ancestral nonsense. Garrick and Hessels versus Anthony Jansen from Salee, or delivery of a young goat. A week later, the record clarifies it as an attempt to recover a kid due for labor. So the goat was not gossip. The goat was payroll, because in New Amsterdam, unpaid labor apparently had hooves. By April 1639, the fiscal had had enough. The council record says Anthony and Grietje were charged as public disturbers, and the fiscal requested that they be banished from the country. Then came the sentence. Anthony Jansen from Salee and Grietje Reyniers, his wife, were named as public disturbers and slanderers, ordered forever banished from New Netherland and made to pay court costs. Forever. Which sounds dramatic. Except Anthony keeps showing up in the records for decades, because apparently forever in New Netherland came with paperwork exceptions. Instead of disappearing, Anthony became tied to land on Long Island, near what would become Gravesend, New Utrecht, and Coney Island. In 1639, Governor Kieft granted Anthony 100 morgens, roughly 200 acres, or about 80 hectares, along the bay opposite Coney Island. Later notes describe this property as Turk's Plantation. So the banishment did not end the problem. It moved it to Brooklyn. And Brooklyn, apparently, was not ready either. By the 1650s, Anthony's story became less about slander and more about land. Boundaries, fences, claims, cattle, neighbors, and Gravesend officials who seemed very determined to make his life difficult. Then, in 1654, the story turns darker. The council record includes the examination of Thomas Southard, identified right there as Anthony Jansen's son-in-law, concerning his imprisoning Anthony at Gravesend. Another record says the commissioners in Anthony Jansen versus Southard could not reconcile the parties, and that an attachment on Anthony's property was ordered removed. So this was not just land drama. This was family drama with shackles. Anthony, the son of a corsair, the man New Amsterdam tried to banish, was imprisoned at Gravesend, and the record points to his own son-in-law as part of the mess. Who steps forward? Grietje, the same woman, once forced to stand under the shame bell, petitioned the colonial authorities when Anthony was seized and held. She was not just scandalous. She was not just loud. She knew how to fight back through the law. That is the part I keep coming back to. Grietje is often described through scandal as difficult, abrasive, notorious, maybe even immoral, depending on who is doing the writing. But the records also show something else. This is a woman who spoke, a woman who could make enemies, a woman who could survive public shame, and a woman, when her husband was dragged into a legal battle and held in shackles, knew exactly where to take the complaint. Anthony and Grietje had 4 daughters: Annika, Cornelia, Eva, and Sarah. And despite their parents' reputations, those daughters married into notable colonial families. This is how ancestry works sometimes. The people who annoyed an entire colony became the roots of respectable descendants. The troublemakers became the ancestors. court cases became the paper trail, and the shame bell becomes content. So for me, case number 2 is not just about Anthony the Turk. It's about Anthony and Grietje together. Jansen was a pirate legend. Anthony and Grietje were the colonial aftermath. They carried the Atlantic world into New Amsterdam. Dutch, German, Moroccan, Muslim background, Christian, settler, outsider, landholder, scandal, survival, all smashed together in one little household. And before New York was New York, before it became the city with an attitude, grudges, hustle, and people yelling like it's a civic duty, there was Anthony the Turk. And there was Grietje Reyniers, the woman who stood under the shame bell, took the hit, and kept swinging. This has been case number 2 from the Ancestorer Detective Agency. And the lesson? Sometimes your ancestors are noble, sometimes they are mysterious, and sometimes they are the reason the Colonial Council had to spend its morning sorting out slander, shackles, and goat-based payroll disputes.